I'm back with the same scarf, but a lot more stubble a few hours later to carry on with part 2 of this discussion of the history of Buddhism in the 20th century and the transition of the problems we're now facing in the 21st century. There are 3 big questions that I want to draw together from the observations and commentary offered in part 1. The first is the general rule that changes in the structure of political power result in changes in religious legitimacy. There's no way to exaggerate how profound the change was in Cambodia when France took over the government. Now, you may know nothing about Cambodia. A small number of people may be watching this who care passionately about Cambodia. But what's amazing to think of is that the French didn't care very much about religion in Cambodia, and the British Empire really didn't care about Buddhism in Burma. But a small number of colonial powers, of colonial administrators, made changes in the structure of political power that profoundly influenced everything from what textbooks were used in schools to what sermons were being given by village monks. If you don't believe me, even a cursory reading of modern scholarship on this always reflects this fact. And, you know, in Cambodia, if you know nothing about it, you may say, well, how is that possible? You know, the institutions that the French created that directly influenced Buddhism in Cambodia, they only employed a small number of people. You know, the interface between the state and religion, you know, was sort of fleeting and insubstantial. They didn't create a Vatican-like structure that you see in Italy. Well, that's true. But nevertheless, those changes at the pinnacle of political power and influence, those changes in the opportunities that shape people's motivations looking to move up the social hierarchy and access money, both government and donation money, have tremendous influence going right down to the local village level within just a few years. And in the same way that in politics generally, changes in one political party will profoundly affect their opposition. At a minimum, the opposition will change the way they present their message. As soon as the French government takes over Cambodia, the protectorate of Cambodia, it doesn't just influence the monks who are willing to play ball with the new government. It also profoundly transforms all of the anti-colonial sentiments, all of the monks who are, in a sense, part of the opposition. Of course, this is going on in the secular world as well as in the religious world, but there's no way to exaggerate that. Many of you watching this don't care in the least about Cambodia. Everything I've just said, you could also say about Myanmar, aka Burma. Everything I've just said is true of the changes in government in Sri Lanka. And everything I've just said, whether or not it makes you uncomfortable, is true about Taiwan also. If you think that the incorporation of Taiwan into the Japanese Empire didn't have a profound effect on Buddhist institutions, and again, that it had a profound effect on the textbooks used in schools to teach children about who they were in their place in the world, it did. It profoundly changed everything. And the outlook of people in Taiwan thinking of the next 100 years and the next 1,000 years being a part of a Japanese world empire that changed everything. And then with the sudden dissolution of that empire and the sudden removal of those textbooks from the classrooms, the textbooks that talked about what the next 1,000 years was going to mean, the sudden removal even of the dictionaries that were being used in the Japanese Empire. If you think that didn't profoundly affect what was going on in Buddhism as a religion, you're wrong. Changes in political structure, even when they involve a small number of people at the top directly, it's amazing how those radiate down to the bottom. It's amazing how they change the motivations and the substance of what's happening at the grassroots. And one of the reasons for that is that in the modern era, in the 20th century, religion is not economically independent. If you had a country where religion really was based on a feudal system of owning slaves and serfs and owning their own farms, then probably you would have a structure of monks and religious authorities who were much more resistant to changes, both in the government as a source of patronage and indirectly how the government shapes their donors. But you don't. The 20th century was an era when monks were, as I've said at length in part one, in large part they were refugees. But even when they weren't refugees, these institutions were beggars that were very responsive to any change in the will of the state, and patron groups that were themselves also seeking upward mobility from the government of their day. The second big question is of how changes in technology entail challenges to authority. So, if you imagine in part one how I described the scarcity of people with the skills and advanced literacy to access the Buddhist Bible, to be blunt. And now, what is the Buddhist Bible? Certainly it's different in the different contexts we're talking about. It's different in Taiwan than it is in Myanmar, Sri Lanka. But in all of these cases, there's a specialized skill set, a type of literacy and even charisma needed for people to approach and make use of canonical authority to express what Buddhism is and what Buddhism is supposed to be. And in the shadow of World War II, at the beginning of this period of time, a very small number of people have those skills or can even fake it. And that concentrates authority in a small number of hands. You can see that in Taiwan, you can see that in Sri Lanka, in all of these diverse situations. There are a small number of people who, as scholar monks, can make claims to authority and who can then balance political conditions to put themselves in worldly religious authority also. That's changed forever. One of the things that has made my own existence in the Buddhist world tense, if not dangerous, or at least perceived as dangerous, is that many times I have sat down with people who have PhDs in Buddhism, who are professors in Buddhism, but they do not know the Buddhist Bible, leaving open the question of which text we're talking about. They themselves are paid interpreters of, paid proponents of a canon of one kind or another. And yet when they sit down to talk to me, sometimes in a conference, a room full of people, I'm the only one who knows what that Bible says. And sadly, that's not a boast. It reflects what I'm talking about. It reflects the fact that many of the people come out of a very deprived background, and they didn't even have access to the type of education I managed to create for myself. I'm a complete autodidact. That's another story for another video. But very often, whether the question is of something like the status of women in Buddhism, you know, modern topical questions, whether the question is the status of suicide in Buddhism, all the questions that come up in 21st century free debate, the reality is that the authority figures around me are very much winging it. They're very much making things up. And they're in fear of people who can put them in check by saying, no, actually, that isn't what the Buddha said in this sutra. And that's one of many things that makes Buddhism dramatically different from Christianity, Islam, or what have you. You wouldn't show up at a conference full of Muslim scholars and be the only person there who knows what's said in the Quran. But Buddhism, coming out of that post-war era, has been in a shifting and unstable relationship to its own sacred text. And those texts made the transition from being an almost unapproachable wall of untranslated and nearly incomprehensible ancient books to being in an instantly accessible digital format. Very few people now can make use of that digital format. Very few people know what they're doing. And most of the people who have some competence are eccentric at best and insane at worst. But nevertheless, 50 years ago, any authority, a monk or a professor, could stand in front of an audience and make up doctrine off the top of his head and be confident that nobody in the audience could challenge him. And today there could be someone in the audience with a laptop computer open or a mobile phone open and checking what the ancient text says. And possibly they've even got a translation in parallel, maybe in halfway decent English, maybe in really bad modern Japanese. Bit by bit, translations are becoming accessible in this way also. So changes in political authority have changed the way legitimate authority is expressed and apprehended, and changes in technology have changed the challenges to that authority. And the result is actually quite anarchic and unstable, just as the question of how economically there's going to be any future for any of these institutions is quite uncertain and unstable. The third and final big question that I started to talk about in part one, and I was cut off by warplanes passing overhead. The difference between war and peace is that those airplanes only go overhead during daylight hours here. Right now it's late at night, so we don't have any airplanes going overhead anymore. If there was a real war on, the noise wouldn't stop. I started to say, before the airplanes interrupted me, that I do not feel the future of Buddhism can be built on a lie. And I condensed the philosophical answer of the late 20th century to one name and one philosopher, Nagarjuna. And I still think that's the concise way to do it. You can talk about, what's called human realm Buddhism, humanistic Buddhism, different attempts to modernize Buddhism, some of them quite eccentric. But what they have in common is this attempt to reach out to Nagarjuna and the philosophy of emptiness as a sort of proxy, in the sense that it's an ancient enough philosophy, yet it's not actually the Buddha's philosophy. It's not actually what you'd find in the Pali Canon. And it's a touchstone of authenticity, but it doesn't actually challenge any institutional bias. It doesn't challenge you on the status of women. It doesn't challenge you on the plight of the poor. It doesn't challenge you on whether or not monks should be going out and helping the homeless, the diseased. It doesn't challenge you institutionally in any of the ways that the 20th century did. Of course, it doesn't challenge you about corruption, as I mentioned, whether or not monks should even have bank accounts and be touching gold and silver and what have you. But it provided this criterion of authenticity that was just so seductive for a wide range of secular and monastic authorities. But it's ultimately a distraction from the problems that those authorities were trying to solve. What's the problem? The problem is what we thought was ancient and authentic in Buddhism, we now learn in the modern era is not. Before World War II or before World War I, obviously the vast majority of people thought of as authentic and real Buddhism whatever their grandparents told them. And if you go back to the Middle Ages in Europe, if you go to any population where most people are illiterate, Obviously, that's a natural way for worldly authority and religious faith to become enmeshed and operate. But the shock of the modern era is learning that Guan Yin is not something taught by the Buddha, is not an ancient and authentic part of Buddhism. Guan Yin is just one example. Part of the challenge of modernity is rediscovering what's ancient and what isn't. Is that now all the different texts that before had been rolled into that canon, that before were part of that wall of books, it was so hard to find what you were looking for in. Suddenly, each one of those books has a year written on it, a year of authorship. And in some cases, there's an author, not the Buddha. So you know who wrote it, when and where, to some extent. Guess what? One of the most important texts in the history of Zen Buddhism was written in Korea, neither in China nor in India. It's problematic. And this information is available to monks, to scholars, and so on. So again, for an outsider, you have to appreciate the passion and desperation with which people wanted to reach out for Nagarjuna to solve these problems or diminish their significance. But Nagarjuna just entails a further stage of the same problem. The Buddha did not teach that form is emptiness and emptiness is form. We have the same problems in trying to elevate Nagarjuna as a standard of adequate, authentic Buddhism, as we would have in trying to take Pure Land and elevate it to be a definitive Buddhist philosophy. Look, millions of people had to face up to the shock that what their grandparents had taught them about Pure Land Buddhism is not what the Buddha taught. That's a kind of existential anguish it's very easy for scholars to paint over or run roughshod over, or just selectively ignore. In the 20th century, millions of people believed that repeating a magical phrase over and over again so that you would get into heaven after you died was definitively authentic, real Buddhism. If we're going to talk about Japan, it gets even crazier. And the perception of which sutras were the most ancient, the most authentic, the most definitive, all of that changed. And it changed in the midst of these terrible distractions that made people uncertain of whether or not Buddhism had any future just a few decades down the road. Guys like Bhikkhu Bodhi, who I find very difficult to relate to. Bhikkhu Bodhi was in Vietnam when the bombs were dropping. And he wasn't in Vietnam as a soldier. He was there as an American wearing a Buddhist monk's robes. And I've seen his comments on that. He says, it's hard to guess his tone. He said, people felt very uncertain about whether or not there was any future for Buddhism in Vietnam at all. That was the horror of the 20th century. If you were in Vietnam and you had American bombs dropping on your head, and then looking ahead to the future, you had the Vietnamese Communist Party and its policies on religion. This is the oblivion of the 20th century for Buddhism that now the 21st century is left picking up bits and pieces from.